On the night of the 14th of September 1940, Luftwaffe bombardiers aboard E-11s approached what their intelligence photographs confirmed was a vital railway marshalling yard outside Ashford, Kent. The rail lines gleamed faintly in the moonlight, parallel tracks converging at junction points, goods wagons clustered near loading platforms, even the distinctive shadow patterns of signal gantries. The bombers released their payloads, 32 250-kilogram high explosive bombs tumbling through 4,000 metres of darkness. Explosions rippled across the target area. Reconnaissance flights the following morning documented extensive damage. Berlin marked it a successful strike against British logistics. There was only one problem: not a single railway sleeper existed at that location. The entire marshalling yard, every rail, every wagon, every signal box, was constructed from painted canvas, timber frames and strategic arrangements of rural debris. Luftwaffe bombers had just expended 4 tons of high explosive on a patch of Kentish farmland that cost the British exactly £847 to prepare. This wasn't a lucky deception, or a one-off gambit. Between 1940 and 1944, British camouflage units constructed over 400 elaborate dummy installations across the United Kingdom. False airfields complete with dummy Spitfires, fake factory complexes with simulated chimneys producing artificial smoke, entire harbour facilities made of painted Hessians stretched over wooden frames. German bombers attacked these phantoms in at least 730 documented raids, dropping an estimated 1,200 tons of ordnance on fields, forests, and carefully prepared theatrical sets. For perspective, that's roughly the bomb tonnage the Luftwaffe dropped on Coventry during its devastating raid of the 14th of November 1940. Except this tonnage achieved nothing beyond rearranging British topsoil. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. The Luftwaffe employed sophisticated photo reconnaissance units, detailed intelligence networks, and experienced bombardiers who studied their targets meticulously. Yet what looked like strategic folly, building fake infrastructure rather than reinforcing real facilities, proved to be one of the war's most cost-effective defensive measures. Those 400 dummy sites diverted hundreds of bomber sorties away from genuine targets, and the mathematics was brutally simple. Every kilogram of German explosive that cratered an empty field was a kilogram that didn't destroy an actual factory, airfield or railway junction. The apparent absurdity of building elaborate lies wasn't waste. It was asymmetric warfare at its most elegant. Standard pre-war military thinking held that aerial reconnaissance had made large-scale deception obsolete. Luftwaffe intelligence officers argued that systematic photographic coverage, combined with agent networks and signals intelligence, would expose any significant dummy installations within days. Their confidence wasn't baseless. German reconnaissance aircraft like the high-altitude Ju-86P could photograph British territory from 12,000 metres, well above effective anti-aircraft range, producing images detailed enough to identify vehicle types and count railway wagons. Photo interpreters at Luftwaffe intelligence centres had access to comprehensive pre-war survey maps, industrial directories and even tourist photographs. They knew where Britain's railways ran, where her factories stood, where her airfields operated. Building fake versions of these installations seemed pointless when the enemy possessed detailed knowledge of what was real. The German approach to target verification emphasised multi-source confirmation. Intelligence officers cross-referenced aerial photographs with agent reports, signals intercepts, and pattern-of-life analysis. A genuine railway marshalling yard would show up in multiple ways: locomotive movements visible in sequential photography, radio traffic from railway operations, workforce patterns observed by agents, smoke plumes from engines, and consistent activity across weeks of surveillance. A dummy yard constructed overnight would lack this historical baseline. Luftwaffe intelligence believed reasonably that absence of historical evidence would immediately flag deceptions. British attempts at large-scale dummy construction would simply waste resources whilst failing to divert any bombs. Yet in reality, British camouflage officers understood something German intelligence consistently underestimated: the psychology of confirmation bias under operational pressure. When a German photo interpreter examined reconnaissance imagery knowing that a target existed in that area, his eye sought confirmation, not contradiction. If intelligence files indicated a railway junction near Ashford, and aerial photographs showed railway-like features near Ashford, The natural cognitive tendency was to confirm the match, particularly when that interpreter was processing hundreds of photographs weekly under pressure to identify targets for upcoming raids. The British weren't trying to fool a leisurely academic examination. They were exploiting the inevitable shortcuts that overworked intelligence officers would take when the operational tempo demanded rapid target assessment. The British dummy site programme began in earnest during autumn 1940, coordinated by Colonel John Turner's Camouflage Directorate and implemented by specialist units, including the 87th Field Company, Royal Engineers and civilian contractors from film studios like Shepperton. What made the programme viable wasn't theatrical trickery. It was systematic engineering based on understanding exactly what aerial reconnaissance could and couldn't resolve. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Beddington, a peacetime film producer who became Turner's deputy, established precise specifications. Dummy installations needed to deceive aerial observation from 3,000 metres altitude under moonlight conditions, but need not withstand close ground inspection. This constraint transformed the economics entirely. A genuine railway marshalling yard required excavation, ballast, steel rails, concrete foundations, signal equipment, and electrical infrastructure, representing months of construction and hundreds of thousands of pounds. A dummy marshalling yard required only those visual elements observable from altitude: parallel linear features simulating rails, rectangular forms suggesting rolling stock, vertical structures resembling signal gantries. Engineers discovered that rails could be simulated using strips of painted canvas laid on the ground. The fabric's sheen under moonlight produced sufficient contrast against grass to register on aerial photography. At 3,000 metres altitude, the human eye couldn't resolve details smaller than roughly 30 centimetres, meaning rails needed only approximate width and spacing. Actual gauge measurements, 1,435mm for standard track, were irrelevant. What mattered was the visual rhythm of parallel lines at the correct approximate separation. Rolling stock presented a different challenge. A goods wagon is approximately 5 metres long, 3 metres wide, and 4 metres high. Dimensions just sufficient to register as distinct objects on high-altitude reconnaissance photographs. British engineers constructed wagon simulacra from timber frames covered with painted hessian, weighted with sandbags to prevent wind displacement. The sandbags served double duty. They provided stability whilst also creating realistic shadow patterns when illuminated by moonlight at low angles. Each dummy wagon cost approximately £3 to construct, compared to roughly £850 for an actual goods wagon. A fake marshalling yard containing 50 dummy wagons thus cost £150 in materials versus £42,500 for actual rolling stock, a cost ratio of 1 to 283. Signal boxes and gantries required vertical structures visible in oblique photography. Engineers used scaffold poles clad with painted boards, creating structures 6 to 8 metres high that cast appropriate shadows. The painting techniques proved crucial, not uniform colours, but weathered patterns matching aged infrastructure. Camouflage officers studied photographs of genuine railway installations, noting how timber weathers to grey, how rust streaks iron, how moss accumulates on north-facing surfaces. They replicated these patterns because photo interpreters unconsciously expected them. A pristine, uniformly painted structure would trigger suspicion precisely because it lacked the visual entropy of real infrastructure. The most sophisticated element was simulating activity patterns. A static installation, even if initially convincing, would eventually be recognised as false when it showed no change across sequential reconnaissance flights. British engineers addressed this through deliberate scheduled modification. Dummy wagons were repositioned weekly using work parties from local Home Guard units. Canvas smoke markers, fabric strips that fluttered in wind, were attached to dummy locomotive chimneys to simulate steam. On some dummy airfields, ground crew physically towed dummy aircraft to different dispersal points, creating the activity patterns that photo interpreters expected from operational bases. This wasn't elaborate theatre, it was minimum viable deception, changing precisely those elements visible from reconnaissance altitude, whilst ignoring details that aircraft cameras couldn't resolve. The programme's effectiveness was first demonstrated through starfish decoy fires, elaborate systems designed to simulate burning cities and draw night bombers away from urban centres. On the night of the 9th of September 1940, Bristol faced a major Luftwaffe raid. Engineers had prepared Starfish Site SF-4A approximately 16 kilometres from the city centre, consisting of fire baskets filled with paraffin-soaked wood and coal, arranged to replicate the street patterns visible in Bristol when burning. When German Pathfinder aircraft dropped incendiaries on Bristol proper, operators ignited the Starfish site. Subsequent bomber waves, navigating by visual reference to the growing fires below, aimed their loads at the decoy. Post-raid assessment determined that approximately 30% of that night's bomb tonnage, roughly 40 tons, had struck open countryside around the Starfish site rather than Bristol itself. The mathematics proved compelling. SF-4A cost £8,200 to construct and approximately £450 per activation in consumed fuel and materials. Assuming each activation diverted even 20 tons of bombs from genuine targets, and that bombs cost Germany roughly £50 per tonne to manufacture and deliver, each Starfish operation wasted enemy resources worth at least £1,000, while saving structures worth potentially hundreds of thousands. Over 237 Starfish sites were constructed across Britain. Records indicate they were activated on at least 730 occasions, drawing an estimated 1,200 tons of bombs away from actual targets. Even accounting for the sites that failed to attract bombs, the resource exchange ratio favoured Britain by perhaps 50 to 1. Daytime deception required different techniques. Q sites, dummy airfields, needed to deceive visual reconnaissance and attract daytime raids away from operational stations. RAF Biggin Hill, one of Fighter Command's crucial sector stations, gained a Q-site dummy airfield constructed 8 kilometres away near Lullingston. Engineers built dummy Hurricanes from timber frames and doped fabric, painting them with appropriate camouflage patterns but leaving them slightly too large, roughly 1.2 times actual scale, because psychology studies had shown that objects appear smaller from altitude than their true size, and oversized decoys compensated for this perceptual shrinkage. Each dummy Hurricane cost £12 to construct versus approximately £3,200 for an actual aircraft, a ratio of 1 to 267. On 2 September 1940, Luftwaffe bombers attacked Lullingston Q site, dropping 26 250-kilogram bombs on the dummy installation, whilst the genuine Biggin Hill escaped that particular raid. Squadron leader James Leithart, commanding 54 Squadron at Hornchurch, later wrote, "We watched Jerry plastering that fake drone for 20 minutes, lovely clusters of bombs right amongst those dummy kites. You almost felt sorry for the bastards, except you knew every bomb they wasted there was one less heading for an actual airfield with actual Spitfires and actual chaps trying to sleep between scrambles." The pattern repeated across southern England. RAF Tangmere's Q site near Shopwike attracted raids on the 16th of August and the 18th of August 1940. RAF Kenley's dummy field at Hookwood drew bombs on multiple occasions. German intelligence documented these attacks as successful strikes against Fighter Command infrastructure. Luftwaffe pilots returning from these missions reported seeing explosions amongst aircraft and structures, which was accurate. Dummy structures do indeed explode when hit. What they couldn't report was that nothing functional had been destroyed. The British programme succeeded because it understood the systemic pressures within German operational planning. Luftwaffe intelligence officers didn't work in isolation. They supported an operational tempo demanding constant target nominations. Bomber groups needed target folders prepared, routes planned, and briefings delivered on compressed schedules. Intelligence officers operating under these pressures couldn't subject every target to exhaustive verification. They performed triage. High-value targets received detailed scrutiny, secondary targets received adequate verification, and tertiary targets were accepted based on reasonable confidence. British dummy sites were engineered to pass the adequate verification threshold, sufficient resemblance to genuine installations that overworked intelligence officers would approve them for targeting rather than delay operations to gather additional confirmation. This wasn't accidental. British camouflage officers explicitly studied German intelligence procedures through captured documents and prisoner interrogation. They learned that Luftwaffe target folders typically included 3 elements: grid coordinates, descriptive intelligence, and aerial photography. Dummy sites were positioned at coordinates that plausibly fit intelligence descriptions: railway marshalling yard 3 kilometres southeast of town, and constructed to match the visual signatures expected from aerial photography. The British weren't trying to create perfect replicas. They were creating satisfactory matches for officers who needed to approve 20 target folders that week and couldn't spend hours scrutinising each one. Consider the case of the dummy aircraft factory constructed near Stoke Orchard in Gloucestershire. This elaborate deception included a main assembly building constructed from timber frames and painted canvas, a series of outbuildings suggesting support facilities, dummy vehicles positioned near loading areas, and even a narrow-gauge railway connecting to the simulated main line. The entire complex cost approximately £15,000 to construct, roughly 1% the cost of an actual aircraft factory. Luftwaffe intelligence files identified an aircraft component manufacturing facility in that region based on signals, intelligence suggesting aviation industry activity, partially genuine, partially British deception feeding, and agent reports describing industrial construction. Which was accurate, they were describing the dummy facility's construction. On the night of the 27th of September 1942, a force of He-11s attacked the Stoke Orchard site, dropping 53 bombs across the complex. Reconnaissance photography showed extensive damage to buildings. Intelligence assessment concluded successful destruction of manufacturing capability. The reality, no manufacturing capability had ever existed. Those 53 bombs, representing roughly 8 tons of explosive and incendiary payload, had achieved nothing beyond creating craters in Gloucestershire soil. Meanwhile, actual aircraft factories at Filton and Castle Bromwich continued production unmolested that night. Captured German documents revealed the psychological mechanism. A Luftwaffe intelligence report from October 1942, recovered after the war, noted, "Target assessment must balance verification thoroughness against operational requirements. When multiple intelligence sources provide consistent target indication, detailed physical verification may be subordinated to operational necessity." Translation: if several intelligence indicators pointed to a target and aerial photography showed structures broadly consistent with those indicators, the target was approved rather than subjected to additional verification that would delay operations. British camouflage officers had engineered dummy sites specifically to trigger this consistent indication threshold, just enough resemblance to expected features that harried intelligence officers would tick the approval box. The dummy railway programme represented the most extensive application of these principles. Britain's railway network was critical infrastructure. Troop movements, munitions transport, coal delivery, food distribution, all depended on functioning rail lines. Luftwaffe targeting priorities naturally emphasised railway interdiction, marshalling yards, junction points, viaducts, tunnels. British engineers responded by constructing elaborate dummy railways that appeared, from altitude, identical to genuine infrastructure whilst containing not a single functional railway component. The masterpiece was the dummy marshalling yard constructed near Folkestone in Kent. Genuine marshalling yards are complex installations, multiple parallel tracks allowing train assembly and disassembly, signal boxes controlling point switches, loading platforms, goods sheds, water towers for locomotives, and typically 50 to 100 wagons in various states of loading or assembly. The Folkestone dummy replicated every visual element. Engineers laid canvas strips simulating 8 parallel tracks extending approximately 400 metres. Timber frame wagons, 93 of them, were positioned along these tracks in realistic arrangements. A dummy signal box rose 7 metres high. Even a water tower was simulated using scaffolding clad with painted boards. The construction took 6 weeks and employed 47 Royal Engineers plus civilian contractors. Total material cost, £2,340. Compare this to a genuine marshalling yard of similar capacity, which would require perhaps £150,000 in construction costs and 6 months of work. The fake yard was operational, meaning ready to deceive reconnaissance, by early October 1940. It attracted its first raid on 14th October, 17 bombs. Another raid struck on 3rd November, 23 bombs. A third attack came on 18th December, 31 bombs. Across 1940 to 1941, the Folkestone dummy yard attracted 9 separate raids totalling 147 bombs, approximately 20 tons of explosive. Railway deception exploited a specific vulnerability in photo interpretation. Railways are linear infrastructure following predictable geographical patterns. When photo interpreters examined railway routes, they traced known lines through the landscape, expecting to find marshalling yards at logical junction points. British engineers positioned dummy yards at precisely these logical locations, places where marshalling yards should exist according to railway operating principles, even if none actually did. This geographical plausibility was crucial. A dummy yard positioned in an illogical location would trigger suspicion. A dummy yard at a natural junction point, where railway planners would logically place such infrastructure, passed initial scrutiny. The programme expanded to include dummy viaducts and false tunnel entrances. When genuine railway tunnels were blocked or damaged, engineers sometimes constructed dummy tunnel portals near the actual sites, positioned to suggest that original tunnels remained functional. German bombers wasted ordnance attacking these false portals, whilst actual railway traffic was rerouted through temporary surface diversions or alternative tunnels. In the Welsh borders, 3 dummy viaducts were constructed near genuine railway lines, timber structures faced with painted canvas, sufficiently substantial to cast appropriate shadows but containing no load-bearing capacity. These attracted at least 4 bombing raids, with German pilots reporting successful strikes against railway infrastructure. Flight Lieutenant David Richards, who flew reconnaissance missions over France in 1943 to 1944, observed the same deception techniques employed by Germans defending their own railways. We'd photograph what appeared to be a bombed marshalling yard, completely destroyed, tracks torn up, buildings collapsed. Next week's photographs would show the same destruction. Then we'd receive intelligence that trains were still running through that location on schedule. Jerry had built a dummy destroyed yard next to the functioning line, hoping we'd tick it off as already neutralised and stop bombing it. Fair play to them, it was exactly what we'd been doing to them for 3 years. The economics of dummy sites reveal why the programme persisted throughout the war. Consider the resource investments from both sides. Britain constructed approximately 400 dummy installations between 1940 and 1944. Total programme cost, including construction, maintenance and operation, was approximately £3.2 million. This employed roughly 600 specialist personnel, Royal Engineers, camouflage officers, civilian contractors, who were not diverted from frontline combat duties, as most were either overage for combat service or possessed specific skills, theatrical design, painting, construction, more valuable in deception roles. Germany expended an estimated 1,200 tons of bombs on dummy sites, roughly 2,400 individual weapons ranging from 50 kilograms to 500 kilograms. Manufacturing cost for German bombs averaged approximately £45 per ton, including fuses with delivery costs, fuel, aircraft wear, crew training hours, adding another £120 per ton. Total German expenditure, approximately £198,000 in direct costs, but this calculation misses the strategic impact. Those 2,400 bombs were delivered in approximately 730 sorties, assuming average loads of 3 to 4 bombs per aircraft. Each sortie represented fuel consumed, aircraft wear incurred, and crew hours expended. More critically, those 730 sorties weren't attacking genuine targets. A Luftwaffe E-111 bomber consumed approximately 900 litres of petrol per combat sortie. The 730 dummy site sorties thus consumed roughly 657,000 litres of aviation fuel. Fuel Germany increasingly struggled to produce as the war progressed, and synthetic fuel plants came under attack. Each sortie also represented approximately 6 hours of aircraft engine operation, accelerating maintenance requirements and wearing out irreplaceable components. For Germany's resource-constrained war economy, these inefficiencies were quietly devastating. The British, meanwhile, calculated that bombs dropped on dummy sites represented bombs not dropped on actual targets. If those 1,200 tons had struck genuine installations, factories, airfields, rail yards, ports, what would the damage have totalled? British post-war analysis estimated that 1,200 tons of bombs, accurately delivered against genuine industrial and transport infrastructure, would have caused approximately £8 to £12 million in direct damage and potentially 2,000 to 3,000 casualties. The dummy site programme thus potentially saved damage worth 2.5 to 3.8 times its entire cost, whilst also saving thousands of lives. Squadron leader Jasper Maskelyne, a pre-war stage magician who served with British camouflage units in the Mediterranean theatre, articulated the principle in his post-war memoir. Magic isn't about creating impossible illusions. It's about understanding what your audience expects to see, then showing them exactly that, with the critical detail missing or misplaced. Jerry expected British railways and factories in certain locations. We showed them railways and factories in those locations. That they were constructed from timber and canvas rather than brick and steel was a detail their reconnaissance couldn't resolve from 4,000 metres up. German intelligence wasn't entirely fooled. By late 1941, Luftwaffe photo interpreters had developed suspicious indicators for potential dummy sites. These included lack of historical activity in sequential photography, absence of supporting infrastructure, workers' accommodations, access roads, power lines, unusual regularity in layout suggesting recent construction, and inconsistent weathering patterns. Some dummy sites were correctly identified and marked as probable deceptions in German intelligence files. Yet this counter-deception awareness created its own problems for German targeting. Once intelligence officers knew Britain employed extensive dummy infrastructure, every target became suspect. Genuine installations showing unusual features might be dismissed as deceptions. This uncertainty paralysed targeting decisions. Officers hesitated to approve raids against facilities that might be elaborate dummies, yet couldn't definitively verify which targets were genuine without exhaustive reconnaissance that operational tempo didn't permit. British deception officers deliberately fostered this uncertainty by occasionally making genuine installations appear slightly suspicious, adding false elements to real factories or slightly exaggerating features at actual airfields. The RAF Tempsford case exemplified this psychological warfare. Tempsford was a genuine Special Operations Executive Airfield housing Halifax bombers and Lysander aircraft, conducting clandestine missions into occupied Europe, a high-value target if the Luftwaffe correctly identified it. British camouflage officers deliberately added exaggerated dummy elements to the real base. Oversized dummy aircraft positioned too regularly, a slightly too perfect camouflage paint scheme on hangars, and suspiciously uniform activity patterns. German reconnaissance photographed Tempsford multiple times. Intelligence assessment concluded, probable deception site, excessive regularity suggests dummy installation. Tempsford was never seriously attacked, despite being photographed at least 15 times. The base continued SOE operations throughout the war precisely because German intelligence decided it looked too much like a dummy to be real. British intelligence monitored German counter-deception through signals intercepts and prisoner interrogation. When captured, Luftwaffe intelligence officers discussed British deception techniques. Interrogators probed for which specific indicators triggered German suspicions. This intelligence fed back into dummy site design, allowing engineers to correct features that German photo interpreters had learned to flag as suspicious. It became a continuous escalation. British deception adapted to German counter-deception, which adapted to British counter-deception. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Buckley, commanding a camouflage unit in 1943, described the evolution. Early dummy sites were rather theatrical, a bit too perfect, honestly. Jerry caught on to some of them, so we made the next generation deliberately imperfect. We'd construct a dummy factory, but leave one corner visibly incomplete, as if we'd run out of materials. We'd position dummy aircraft with one wing slightly damaged, showing we'd patched up a prang. We added visual entropy, the random imperfections that real infrastructure accumulates. Jerry's photo interpreters were looking for perfection, which signalled fakery. We gave them plausible imperfection instead. By 1944, British dummy site construction had evolved into a sophisticated operational art. When Allied forces prepared for D-Day, elaborate dummy infrastructure appeared across southeastern England, apparent staging areas for an invasion of the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. These installations included dummy landing craft, constructed from canvas stretched over wooden frames floating in estuaries, dummy tank parks, inflatable rubber tanks developed specifically for large-scale deception, and dummy wireless traffic suggesting major force concentrations. Operation Fortitude, the overall D-Day deception plan, employed dummy infrastructure as a critical component, physical evidence supporting the fiction that Allied invasion forces were positioned for a Pas-de-Calais assault. German intelligence photographed these dummy installations extensively. Wehrmacht commanders in France positioned significant forces to defend Pas-de-Calais based partly on this physical evidence of Allied preparations. Even after D-Day landings commenced in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, German commanders hesitated to redeploy forces from Pas-de-Calais, believing the Normandy invasion might be a feint preceding the real invasion further north. This operational paralysis, enemy commanders unable to trust their intelligence because they knew British deception was extensive but couldn't determine which intelligence was genuine, represented deception's ultimate success. The principles established by Britain's 1940 to 1944 dummy site programme influenced post-war military deception doctrine. The fundamental insight that overworked intelligence analysts operating under operational pressure are vulnerable to confirmation bias, and that providing satisfactory rather than perfect deceptions can exploit this vulnerability, became foundational to military deception planning. Modern camouflage doctrine still emphasises creating deceptions that